When most people hear Tyrannosaur, one image pops up instantly: Tyrannosaurus rex. But T-Rex wasn't the first tyrant to reach the top of its ecosystem. Around 70 million years ago, Asia had its own apex predator, Tarbosaurus. It lived earlier, hunted a different mix of prey, and came from a landscape that pushed predators toward a very specific style of killing. This isn't a T-Rex in Asia story. It's a story about what happens when the Tyrannosaur blueprint gets tested in a tougher environment. One where visibility is worse, prey can be much more massive, and opportunities come and go fast. That's why the scarier part isn't about a single stat. It's about the kind of world that produced Tarbosaurus in the first place. The place Tarbosaurus lived would shock you if you only knew about the Gobi as a desert. Back then, parts of it were wetter and greener, a floodplain broken up by rivers, marshes, forest patches, and wide muddy flats. The landscape didn't stay the same all year either. Wet seasons and dry seasons would have changed where animals gathered and how long food lasted. Instead of being predictable, this landscape was constantly rearranging itself. Rivers shifted their paths. Wet ground hardened, then softened again. Areas that were safe one month could become traps the next. Animals couldn't rely on familiar routes or stable feeding grounds for long. For a predator, that kind of instability changes how you hunt. You don't just learn where prey is, you learn where prey has nowhere else to go. Some seasons forced animals into narrow corridors. Others pushed them into unfamiliar ground, and every shift created moments where even large, well-defended herbivores were briefly exposed. In a place like this, success didn't come from chasing harder or fighting longer. It came from recognizing when the landscape itself tilted the odds. That's the kind of environment that rewards efficiency over aggression, and it's the kind of environment that shaped Tarbosaurus. Tarbosaurus also dealt with a prey community that wasn't a perfect match for what a T-Rex saw later in North America. There were hardosaurs, armored dinosaurs, and large-bodied animals that could take damage and still keep moving. It's the kind of prey list that forces a predator to be careful with energy and careful with risk. In a world like this, the top hunter isn't necessarily the loudest or the most aggressive. It's the one that wastes the least. Tarbosaurus looks a lot like the Tyrannosaur you already know, but its skull hints at a different emphasis. Compared to T-Rex, it was generally narrower. That changes how the jaws fit together and how force travels through the skull when it bites. It also affects the eyes. T-Rex is famous for strong forward-facing vision, while Tarbosaurus likely had less of that advantage. That sounds like a downgrade until you picture the environment. In dense terrain, you're not spotting prey from half a mile away. Encounters can happen close, sometimes with cover in the way. In that situation, the job isn't lock on from a distance. The job is to commit fast when the moment appears. Tarbosaurus' head and teeth were built for that kind of work. Deep bites, solid grip, and damage that takes effect quickly. It wasn't designed for long pursuits in open landscapes. Tarbosaurus shows what happens when a predator commits to a single method. No horns, no armor, no flashy silhouette. What it had was a body that looked like it was assembled around one idea. The head does the work, and the rest of the animal supports the head. That's where the tiny arms come in. T-Rex has famously small arms. Tarbosaurus takes it even further. At that scale, the arms aren't grabbing prey or holding anything in place at all. They're basically along for the ride. That tells you something important. Tarbosaurus wasn't trying to control prey with its hands. When an animal evolves into that kind of specialist, it usually means the environment rewards a single reliable method over and over again. It's easy to assume that the most dangerous predator is always the biggest one, but size comes with a cost. The larger an animal is, the more food it needs. The more food it needs, the more often it has to hunt. And the more often it hunts, the more chances there are for something to go wrong. Tarbosaurus was enormous, but not excessive. It was big enough to threaten almost anything in its environment, but not so large that it became slow, clumsy, or energetically inefficient. That balance matters more than people realize. In unstable ecosystems, being slightly leaner can be an advantage. It means you burn fewer calories standing still. It also means you can survive longer gaps between meals, and injuries take slightly less out of you. That doesn't sound like much, but over years it's everything. A predator that needs one less successful hunt per month is a predator that survives droughts, bad seasons, and unlucky streaks. Tarbosaurus didn't need to be the biggest animal in the ecosystem. It needed to keep functioning when conditions stopped being forgiving. People get obsessed with bite force, but bite force is only useful if it produces a result you can repeat. With Tarbosaurus, the bite wasn't just a heavy hit. It was a way to take control of the situation. Large prey doesn't have to win to survive. A lot of the time, it just needs to break contact and escape. So the predator's job is to reduce those escape options fast. Tarbosaurus had a heavily built skull and jaws adapted to stay stable under stress. Some interpretations even suggest jaw features that help keep the bite rigid and secure during a struggle. The effect is the same either way. Once Tarbosaurus latched on, it had a better chance of keeping that contact long enough for the damage to matter. That's what makes Tyrannosaurs different from slashing predators. They don't need to land 10 perfect cuts. They need one committed bite that turns into a problem the prey can't solve. The prey animals in Tarbosaurus' world weren't defenseless. Speed, armor, and sheer size meant that even a small mistake could turn a hunt into a fatal encounter. That creates a brutal balance. Prey had to stay alert. Tarbosaurus had to choose carefully because injury is expensive at that scale. So Tarbosaurus likely leaned into the same principle most apex predators use today. Don't fight fair if you don't have to. It focused on animals that were already at a disadvantage, those separated from the group, falling behind, or weakened by age, illness, or exhaustion. Not because it's evil, that's just predator math. Hunting isn't about proving strength, it's about turning risk into food, while staying in good enough shape to hunt again next week. And when the prey is huge and dangerous, that mindset becomes even more important. This is where Tarbosaurus earns its reputation. Late Cretaceous Asia still had giant sauropods, titanosaurs, animals that could dwarf even a large tyrannosaur in total mass. A lone predator taking on something bigger than itself sounds unrealistic, but bigger doesn't mean safe. Some weaknesses become more dangerous the larger an animal gets. A massive animal has a harder time recovering from deep injury. Blood loss and shock affect it more severely. And if a leg is compromised, the whole body becomes a problem. Tarbosaurus didn't need to overpower prey outright. It needed an opening it could exploit. A serious wound was often enough. Once an animal was bleeding, weakened, or unable to keep pace, the balance shifted quickly. The fossil records suggest Tarbosaurus interacted with large-bodied prey often enough that this wasn't rare or accidental. Not every encounter ended cleanly, but the ecosystem had reached a point where even giants were no longer off limits. Once that threshold was crossed, there was no going back. To survive at the top, Tarbosaurus needed more than power. It needed awareness. In a landscape full of cover and shifting terrain, smell is huge. Tyrannosaurs are known for having an excellent sense of smell, and Tarbosaurus likely used scent to track prey, find carcasses, and detect what was happening in its territory before it ever saw it. Hearing matters too. Large animals don't move quietly through wetlands and forests. A herd's movement carries sound. Distress calls also carry sound. Even the pattern of bird activity can tip off a predator if it's paying attention. So Tarbosaurus wasn't just wandering around hoping to bump into something. It was gathering information constantly, because the first predator to locate an opportunity is usually the one that eats. Being an apex predator doesn't mean living without risk. When a small animal is injured, it can disappear into cover and avoid attention. For something the size of Tarbosaurus, injury is far more dangerous. A wounded giant can't hide, and scavengers notice that. Rivals notice. Even a slight limp can invite a challenge. That meant Tarbosaurus lived under constant pressure. Smaller theropods and opportunistic animals would have followed it, waiting for leftovers or a moment of weakness. Even other Tarbosaurs could become a threat when food was scarce or a large carcass drew competition. Seasonal changes only made that pressure worse. Droughts concentrated animals around shrinking water sources, turning feeding sites into conflict zones. Floods scattered prey and forced predators to travel farther for every meal. So Tarbosaurus didn't survive by brute strength alone. It survived by being consistent, ending encounters quickly, avoiding injury, and feeding before the kill attracted attention. For apex predators, injury is often more dangerous than starvation. A broken bone doesn't heal quickly at 5 tons. An affected wound doesn't stay small. And a limp doesn't just slow you down, it draws attention from everything else in the ecosystem. That reality shapes behavior. Tarbosaurs couldn't afford reckless aggression. Every hunt had to justify the risk, and every approach had to reduce the chance of a counterattack. This is why Tarbosaurs likely appeared cautious at times. It hesitated, waited, and abandoned bad angles. Not out of fear, but because experiences taught them what happens when they commit at the wrong moment. When Tarbosaurs did commit, it likely aimed to end the encounter quickly. The longer a fight lasted, the greater the risk of a bad fall, a tail strike, or a lucky hit from prey that outweighed it. The constant pressure shaped how Tarbosaurs lived and hunted. Every decision carried consequences, and there was no room for wasted effort. Survival at that scale depended on doing what worked, consistently. Speed gets a lot of attention when people talk about predators, but it isn't always the deciding factor, especially at large body sizes. In muddy floodplains, forests, and broken terrain, raw speed can become a liability. A sprint means nothing if the ground gives way, and momentum turns dangerous if you can't stop or change direction. Tarbosaurus was built for control. Its mass helped keep it stable, especially on uneven ground. Its tail played a key role in managing sudden shifts in balance, while the legs delivered power without relying on long pursuits. In environments where prey can vanish into cover or pivot suddenly, the predator that controls the encounter has the advantage. Positioning matters. Staying upright matters. Absorbing impact without losing balance also matters. Tarbosaurus didn't need to win races, it needed to win moments. And in a world full of massive, dangerous prey, that difference meant everything. If Tarbosaurus was so good at what it did, why isn't it here today? Because no apex predator survives when the entire system collapses. At the end of the Cretaceous, the planet took a hit that destroyed food chains from the bottom up. When plants fail, herbivores crash. When herbivores crash, predators follow. A Tyrannosaur sits at the top of the pyramid, and pyramids don't stand if the base disappears. So Tarbosaurus didn't vanish because it got replaced by something better. It vanished because the world stopped supporting them. That's the humbling truth. And it brings us back to the question at the beginning. Why Tarbosaurus can feel like the scarier older brother of the Tyrannosaurus rex. Not because it was stronger and not because it was larger, but because it represents what the Tyrannosaur design looked like when survival came down to precision instead of display. Tarbosaurus lived in a world where encounters happened up close, where prey could be enormous and where mistakes carried immediate consequences. It was shaped by those pressures, refined by them, and successful because of them. Tyrannosaurus rex came later, in a different landscape, and became the symbol. Tarbosaurus shows what the lineage had already learned by then. Not how to dominate an ecosystem, but how to survive at the edge of one. Until next time on Fossil Flix.